I don't know if you know this, but one of Blackwater's original lawyers was Fred Fielding, who now is the White House counsel to President Bush. And more recently, Blackwater's lawyer has been Ken Starr, the man who led the impeachment charge against President Clinton. And those are just two of the names that you're going to hear tonight that have very close proximity to both the White House and to Blackwater USA. I'm sure that many of you are aware of the events of September 16th that happened in the Mansour neighborhood in Baghdad at a place called Nisr Square, but I just want to run through a little bit of what happened that day and use that as a starting point for this discussion tonight. You see, Blackwater's primary job in Iraq is to, as the industry slang goes, protect the noun, person, place, or thing. Blackwater's been very effective at its job in Iraq. It's kept alive every single U.S. ambassador in the country, from Paul Bremer through Ambassador Ryan Crocker. It's protected Condoleezza Rice when she's gone over there, Secretary of State Colin Powell when he was serving, Tony Blair, 90 congressional delegations. They have 1,000 armed operatives in Iraq. Many of them are former Navy SEALs or Delta Force. And so when Blackwater's men are operating in the country, it's oftentimes outside of the confines of the Green Zone, or as many Iraqis call it, the Green Zoo, because it's where the occupation officials are sort of trapped. In the rest of Iraq, they refer to as the Red Zone, the Hot Zone. And so the way that Blackwater operates is that they have heavily armed convoys that keep that noun alive when they're guarding Ambassador Crocker or other senior occupation officials. And what they're supposed to do if they encounter Iraqi vehicles is use what's called graduated force. Now imagine, if you will, a desert. And I'm gonna put forward an example that on the surface is just kind of lunatic stuff. But let's just imagine we're in a big empty space and you see a car coming at you. Under the graduated rules of force, a Blackwater operative would have to hold up his fist to tell the car to back off as it's at a distance. If it keeps approaching, then they can fire in front of the car. If it keeps approaching, they can shoot out the grill of the car. And if it keeps approaching, they can then shoot the driver. But imagine that scene happening in downtown Manhattan, in Times Square, where it takes place in 2 seconds. That's how we end up with these kinds of incidents that happened in Nisr Square. And on that day, what happened is that the Blackwater convoy was heading into the square, driving down the wrong side of the road. The Iraqi police scrambled to try to stop traffic. Iraqis know well what happens when they get too close to these mercenary details that are protecting senior occupation officials. And so they entered Nisr Square, and the police were stopping cars, and there were vehicles behind the Blackwater convoy as it came through, and an explosion went off in the distance, but the witnesses to the scene said that it was so far that no one could have perceived it as a direct threat, and yet the Blackwater men stopped and they ordered the cars behind them to turn around and drive back in the other direction. And then they proceeded on, and an Iraqi vehicle allegedly didn't stop fast enough when the police were trying to stop it, and it entered the square, and Blackwater operatives opened fire on the vehicle and shot the driver. And then they launched some kind of a grenade or another projectile at the vehicle, and it exploded and engulfed the vehicle in flames. Blackwater later said that it was ambushed by armed insurgents, and it said the people that it had killed were, quote, enemies. But inside that vehicle, when this shooting began in Nisr Square on September 16th, were not members of Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia or members of Muqtada al-Sadr's Mahdi army. It was a young Iraqi family. The driver that they shot was the father. The other 2 passengers were a mother holding her infant child. Witnesses say that when the grenade hit the car and it was engulfed in flames, that the body of the child and the mother melted together. And that's how the shooting began that day. We back up a moment to those cars that were told to turn around and drive away. The person who was in the lead vehicle behind Blackwater was an Iraqi lawyer who was late for a court date. He had turned around, and he says that the Blackwater operatives fired on him. 12 bullets hit his car, 4 of them pierced his back, but he lived to tell the tale. And I want to read you what he said from his hospital bed. He said, "I saw women and children jump out of their cars and start to crawl in the road to escape being shot. But still the firing kept coming, and many of them were killed. I saw a boy of about 10 leaping in fear from a minibus. He was shot in the head. His mother was crying out for him. She jumped out after him, and she was killed." He said, "Why did they open fire? I do not know. No one, I repeat, no one had fired at them. The foreigners had asked us to go back, and I was going back in my car, so there was no reason for them to shoot." In all that day, Iraqi medical sources now say that as many as 28 people may have been killed, a number that could very well grow because there are people with very critical injuries that remain in the hospital. The press continues to report 11. Whether it's 11 or 28 is irrelevant at this point. It was a massacre in Nisr Square that day. In fact, it's being called Baghdad's Bloody Sunday. What happened in the immediate aftermath of that incident is that The Iraqi Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, was under the misguided impression that he was actually the Prime Minister of Iraq for about 72 hours. He didn't realize that Condoleezza Rice is actually the President of Iraq. And so she called Nouri al-Maliki very quickly after he had announced that Blackwater was going to have its operating license revoked, and the Interior Ministry said that Blackwater was going to be expelled from the country and that the men who had committed what they called the criminal acts on that day were going to be prosecuted in Iraqi courts. And in fact, Blackwater's operations did shut down for a few days. Inside of the green zone were trapped all of the occupation officials. The U.S. government told them they could not leave that area. So central is Blackwater's operations to the occupation that when they're shut down, the occupation remains inside of the zoo. But Condoleezza Rice called Nouri al-Maliki ostensibly to apologize, but she made clear, abundantly clear, that Blackwater wasn't going anywhere. Within 5 days of that shooting, Blackwater's operatives were armed and on the streets of Iraq again. Perhaps it was the most pronounced evidence of the utter lack of any Iraqi sovereignty whatsoever. And what's interesting is we've seen an extraordinary pushback from the Bush administration against the Iraqi government over this one company, Blackwater USA. It's not as though Blackwater is the only mercenary company in Iraq. There's more than 170 of them. That's almost as many nations as there are registered at the UN. I repeat, there are over 170 private military companies like Blackwater offering their services in Iraq right now. So why the pushback? Why not just say, all right, Blackwater's image is tarnished. We'll continue with the investigation. We want to protect our diplomats, and so we'll hand it over to another company. See, Blackwater isn't just any private security company in Iraq. It is the elite mercenary company of the U.S. occupation with very deep connections to the Bush White House.